When English parents told stories to their children, they often spoke of monsters, trolls, wild beasts, and witches. Those were savage stories, strange and disturbing. Since everyone knew there was a savage side to life, the stories had a kind of realness to them, even when they were make-believe. But those weren't the only stories they told. There were tales of splendor and goodness, too. Every child heard the Bible's first story, which is of a Garden of Eden. Eden was a place of great beauty, a paradise. Many of the goodness stories were about sweet, simple people who lived in harmony with nature. But those stories seemed real too, because there was much goodness in the world. Did you know that the stories you read in childhood stay with you all your life? They influence adults more than most of them realize. So when English men and women learned of a land of great beauty, where people lived close to nature, many of the English thought of that land as paradise. They called the natives savages, but the first English visitors to the New World described the Indians as courteous and gentle and great. But later, when others met them, they found they didn't always act as people do in storybooks. Soon, some were calling them worse names than savages. They called them beasts. Some said they were servants of the devil. Others said they were part animal and part human. But those people, the Indians, were just real people, like the English. They lived in families, in towns, governed by leaders. They farmed, hunted, played games, and fashioned beautiful objects. Some of them were wise and some were foolish. Some were kind and some were mean. But most were a bit of all those things. One of the most interesting Indians the English would meet was the Powhatan, the ruler or emperor of eastern Virginia. His real name was Wahhasanakak, and he had inherited an empire of 5 tribes. Through daring, strength, and leadership, Powhatan soon held sway over dozens of villages and thousands of Indians. The English would call the Indians of his empire Powhatan Indians. They were woodland Indians who spoke Algonquian dialects and hunted, fished, and farmed in a region of great abundance. The area surrounded the Chesapeake Bay and went west to mountain foothills and south to what would someday be North Carolina's border. It was a land of rivers, bays, and estuaries, of ducks, geese, wild turkeys, and deer, of fertile soil, fish, and shellfish, of wild berries, nuts, and grapes. Powhatan's people raised vegetables, corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins, which was more than half the food they ate. Because they farmed, they lived in settled villages. Corn was their most important food. They ground it and made it into flat pancakes that served as bread or rice does in many other countries. Aside from corn, the food they ate changed with the seasons. Fresh vegetables in summer and fall, game in winter, and fish stored nuts and berries in the spring. Spring was when corn supplies ran low, and they sometimes went hungry. There was much small game in the region: raccoon, possum, squirrel, turkey, and rabbit. But it was deer these Indians relied on most for food and clothing. Unfortunately, like people elsewhere, they overhunted. Deer became scarce, and they knew if they roamed outside the Powhatan's territory looking for better hunting grounds, they risked war with the other tribes. It was the men who hunted, fished, and fought. Women farmed. Men and women had set roles in this society and rarely changed them. Children helped their parents, played, and didn't go to work until they were young adults. The boys often played in scarecrow houses that stood in the middle of the fields. From there, they threw stones at rabbits or other animals that might nibble on the crops. It trained their throwing arms, and that helped when they became hunters. Little girls played with clay, made pots, and helped their mothers plant and cook. Boys and girls played running games. There were no horses. They hadn't arrived in this part of the New World yet. So fast runners were prized. Sometimes they would dress up like their parents, painting their bodies and wearing necklaces and bracelets of shells and beads and animal bones. Men and women tattooed beautiful designs all over their bodies. Men sometimes hung animal claws, birds' wings, bats, even live green snakes around their necks. They rubbed themselves with bear grease. It repelled mosquitoes, kept them warm, and made their skin glisten in the sunshine. Most of the year, these Indians needed little clothing, although in winter they wore deerskin garments and sometimes cloaks of feathers or furs. The great Powhatan had a beautiful deerskin sewed with designs in lustrous pearls. Powhatan had stacks of deerskins and a storehouse of corn, and he had copper and pearls. The tribes brought all this and more to him. It was tribute given to a ruler. Each tribe had its own leader, called a werowance, and also priests and healers and others with power. But the Powhatan was special. All those who met him noted it. He knew how to command, when to be stern and unforgiving, and when to be understanding. The story was told of the time he visited the Potowmaks, who were under his rule. The young Potowmak warriors came before him, and each told of awesome deeds of valor against fierce enemies or wild beasts of the forest. Finally, one young man stood before Powhatan and said, "I, my lord, went this morning into the woods and valiantly killed 6 muskrats. While that may be no more than boys do, it is true, while much you have heard is fable." When Powhatan heard that, he broke into laughter and gave a reward to the truth-teller. Powhatan's priests had foretold that his mighty empire would one day be destroyed by men from the east. The Chesapeakes, who lived by the ocean, were the easternmost of his tribes. Perhaps that is why, just before the 16th century turned into the 17th, in the European method of reckoning, Powhatan fought the mighty Chesapeake Indians and left them weak and powerless. Powhatan didn't yet know that 3 small ships were heading for his realm. They were coming across the ocean from an island far to the east.